Stories are the only thing that makes us immortal.
The story that Leadville's telling is the story of the United States, the story of America.
The Irish in Leadville represent so many. It's like a window into many different stories that have been untold in Colorado history.
Stories that have been buried can be unearthed. Stories can begin to live again, begin to breathe again. The story is the closest distance between two people.
The Irish Memorial is a beautifully designed memorial. So that is to honor the people who have lived and struggled and died here.
In Leadville, our demographic has always been a community of immigrants.
I definitely define Leadville an immigrant community because there is, such a big population of Latinos.
Because that's what the memorial is really about, is honoring those who have been before us, remembering of them, remembering of the people who have come after them and moved on.
It isn't just about miners. It's about the struggle of immigration and really that human experience connecting the hope for something better and the risk of leaving something behind. And that transcends race and time.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund, supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past. With additional funding provided in memory of Deanna E. LaCamera by Hassel and Mary Ann Ledbetter, and by members like you. Thank you. With special thanks to the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and to these organizations.
The story of immigration in Colorado has many common themes. So there's multiple waves of immigration that would form our state. Places like Leadville and other places that were like mining centers in the Rocky Mountains needed really any kind of immigrant labor that they could bring in. And the Irish were a really good source of labor because, one, there were push factors in Ireland, like the famine and poverty, ongoing poverty, that really pushed people out, especially young people, out of Ireland to seek better opportunities. And two, they were English speakers. And so that was a huge advantage that the Irish brought with them.
So the Irish, they were the largest immigrant community in the city. By 2 to 1 at any given time in Leadville, in the early 1880s, there were upwards of 3,000 people who were born in Ireland living in Leadville. Now that's more people than live in Leadville total today. So that tells you just how large this community was.
When you think of the Leadville's heyday in the 1880s and 90s, what was going on in the greater United States was mirrored in Leadville as well. The disdain for Irish immigrants, stereotypes around the drinking of the Irish and the big families, and how Catholics were brutish and uneducated and leaving Ireland because of the Great Hunger, just becoming a burden on society.
At the same time in Colorado, you have the rise of different groups that went on to become the second KKK, the second Ku Klux Klan. At one point, it's estimated that about 5% of Colorado's population were Klan members. And they were not just targeting African Americans like they did in the South during the first Klan, but they were targeting anyone who they saw as un-American. So that included these newer immigration groups and anyone who was not white, anyone who was Catholic and Jewish. So all of those immigration groups were targets. And really the strong influence of the Klan in industry and politics in Colorado is partly a backlash to the influx of those immigrant groups.
The movement was dependent upon the way that the mainstream community saw these Irish immigrants. who were already being demonized and dehumanized and caricaturized.
Today, we see those same sort of themes repeating themselves with newer immigrant groups. One of them are the Latino immigrants coming from various Latin American countries. And we see the same patterns repeating: segregation in housing, especially in the mountain towns in Colorado, where, the cost of living within these very nice mountain towns is out of reach for the working class. And so you see them relegated to areas of town like shanty towns or entirely different communities.
The relationship of immigrants is looking for work and looking to provide for your family. Access to resources and basic needs and things that help families thrive. We have a big Latino community that commutes to the neighbor ski resort towns to work. Housing in Leadville used to be very much more affordable compared to our neighbor counties. Most of the Latino community lives in the mobile home parks.
I think 40% of the city are immigrants, but many of the tourists would come here and visit and spend time here and have no idea that there's a large immigrant community here, because that community is segregated and somewhat marginalized.
And so you think there's no immigrants in Leadville, but then you have boom days and you will see the immigrant community. We have had an event, we call it Fiestas Patrias, which is like the Latino country's independence celebration. It's like the month of September, and you get to see that the immigrant community, is there.
Leadville's always been a place where immigrant workers find opportunity and hope and community. That continues today. But the struggle and the ostracism and all of that is still very real today. That hasn't gone away.
There's a sense of maybe forgetting that others are really just doing their best to survive. And I think of my ancestors who wants to leave their homes, I'm sure their loved ones in Ireland, who wants to leave their loved ones in the Dominican Republic and in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, who wants to leave their communities that where they grew up in. You don't do that unless you have to. You feel forced to.
The story of the Irish diaspora is a Leadville story too. They are an important part of this history. Most of the Irish came during the famine.
Well, there were multiple famines in Irish history. The one everyone knows about, that's often called the potato famine, is 1845 until 1852. And the population of Ireland went from over 8 million to around 5 million. The Irish became dependent upon the potato because you can feed a lot of people for cheap. So the potato allowed the Irish population to grow, and then the fungus killed the crops and killed successive years, and they were completely vulnerable.
The time period of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in Ireland, the Great Hunger, created such a need in which you couldn't survive necessarily in Ireland that immigrating was one of the only choices, and going to the United States held that promise of a better life.
The Leadville Silver Rush started, so you have hundreds of Irish families fleeing, and they're hearing about Leadville.
The Irish who came here, and most of them came from what's called the Beara Peninsula, which is southern Ireland, which is at sea level. There was a lot of mining there. So what they brought to Colorado, to Leadville, was mining. They were experts. They were miners. They had been all their life. Sometimes they were multi-generational miners. And they brought that expertise to Leadville, and it was of great value.
The decision to come to America from Ireland was dangerous from the beginning. I mean, they called those ships coffin ships because many of them never made it. And the people back home would never see their relatives or their friends ever again. So if they even made it to the United States, that was progress. It took a young person with a long life ahead of them with these hopes and dreams of creating this better life in America. So that drew a lot of youth. In addition, the work itself, the back-breaking work of miners, really required a young body and made those young bodies old very quickly.
Leadville in and of itself was one of the largest per capita concentrations of Irish people in the American West. They were largely young males, unmarried, and not planning to move to Leadville to make a home and start a family, but the idea was to get rich and then go somewhere else where home really was.
Mining in general, the conditions were deplorable. Mining was one of the most dangerous industries. The job itself, very dangerous. You're using heavy machinery. You're going into dark places. And the Irish were a very easily exploitable labor force. And so that just compounded the danger of the job.
The health conditions for the Irish immigrants and most immigrants to Leadville were super challenging. There was no such thing as a paid sick day. If you missed a day of work, you just missed a day of work, and you'd be lucky if your job was there when you got back.
There were no benefits for these workers. This was, before the successes of the labor movement really took place. Whatever support was provided usually came from the community itself and not the company, because they didn't have to. They could get away with not taking care of their labor force.
The working conditions, as in most early industrial places, were very atrocious, and the tension between the worker and the owner was significant.
The labor movement emerged in places that had these heavy industries, very exploitive industries, and in Colorado that was mining. They saw a lot of the labor activity and eventually some of the strongest unions that came out of the mining industry.
There were several labor strikes that happened. They were put down violently, and they were not largely successful. At one point, the National Guard was brought in to put down strikers. There was clashes and violence. At one point, they locked arms across the street for the National Guard to be coming up, and they were bayoneted, and several of them were killed.
The Irish began the first labor unions here to push back against conditions and low pay and to demand the right to form a union. The Irish formed labor unions through the Knights of Labor, which was the first national labor union in the United States. They formed a miners' union here, and they struck in 1880, and 5,000 miners walked out of the mines, led by this 28-year-old Dublin-born Michael Mooney.
Michael Mooney, what a character. His story was not told in the traditional narratives of Colorado history, and his contributions were great. He contributed significantly to the working class movement in Leadville.
Michael Mooney is one of the most important figures in Colorado history no one's ever heard of. He was chosen by the miners as their leader in 1880 when they decided to strike. The miners were paid $3 a day. They were fighting against very unsafe conditions. When the bosses responded to their organizing efforts by banning them from talking when they were working, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the miners walked out, paraded through Main Street from south to north, 5,000 miners in single file in silence. I mean, try to imagine the power of that. They said, "Michael, you're our leader." He was so respected. His approach was, we are a nonviolent movement. We will stay peaceful. He understood the importance of the way that the mainstream community saw these Irish immigrants who were already being demonized and dehumanized and caricaturized. There wasn't a single act of violence committed during that strike, but the business community responded as if the city had just been occupied by an armed force. Led by Horace Tabor, the business community used their political leverage and leaned on the governor to declare martial law. Martial law is declared. Hundreds of soldiers are stationed in Leadville with orders to arrest all strikers on vagrancy laws and force them to work in chain gangs building roads. After a few weeks, they realized they couldn't win this, and so the strike was crushed militarily.
Those strikes were unsuccessful because it was during the Gilded Age when the federal government really took the side of corporations. It was during that early progressive era when we start to see people, working class people attaining a working class collective identity, beginning to come together and to organize against their managers, the owners. The fate of Irish miners was overall, it was a sad story. It's a sad narrative. Many did not live to old age. They died young because of the nature of the job. And if it wasn't the dangers of the daily life of a miner, it was the toll it took over time. It was a life that was cut short, coming in with big dreams, the American dream, believing that the streets were paved with gold here in the United States, and then meeting that fate of backbreaking labor, very little recognition for your labor, a denial of dignity, and in most cases, an early death.
Leadville was not a social space where people were coming here and finding their dream and striking it rich. Leadville was a place where mining had become corporatized, and the only mining you will be doing here is for a wage, and for a very low wage, and to make other people rich. And so the exploitation of immigrant workers was how that whole system worked. And so that pauper cemetery is the most prominent visual representation of that economic system that exists.
They were just struggling to get by, and I think that that's why you see so many of the paupers' graves filled with Irish people, because they couldn't afford even to buy a burial plot.
It has everything to do with social class. We see the history of that class segregation in the way people are buried. Many of them were just placed in pauper graves, like the one in the Evergreen Cemetery in Leadville. Even in death, those rigid segregation lines are enforced.
I wish I was in Carrickfergus.
These sunken graves are paupers' graves, sometimes called Potter's Field. Typically, they were buried in cheap pine boxes, and they couldn't afford to pay the $15 fee for burial. That would have been about a week's wages for a miner. So they were buried in rows. You can tell that they did their best to make them a dignified burial. They put wooden slabs next to the graves with the names etched on them in ink. There are more pauper graves in that cemetery than there are marked graves. And that tells you all you need to know about Leadville. To go there and see that section and wander through the forest for acres and acres, that's, I think, what makes the space so powerful. There's a visual and a visceral impact to be there and to see that. And you can't help but notice the human toll of industrial labor when you see those sunken holes. And especially when you know that half of them are children, that 45% are under the age of 5. The average age of the people buried there is 22. So when you begin to absorb that, it completely removes one from the glorified Wild West history that has been pushed on us. And we recognize that these social spaces that we call mining booms were not the Wild West where people struck it rich. They were places of intense exploitation of predominantly immigrant labor.
Everyone's story matters. So I always think about it as Colorado history is one puzzle. And without the stories of those paupers, those people who never made it into the history books, we don't have a complete picture of what Colorado history really is and how we got to where we are today. And so by uncovering, by exploring, by examining who is buried in the pauper section of the Evergreen Cemetery, we get a fuller picture of our state, and we also understand the experiences of the working class in Leadville.
Dr. Jim Walsh has devoted his life to really learning about the Irish in Leadville and labor struggles around the American West. He has been able to learn about the folks who are buried out there in Evergreen Cemetery and look at records that people have not seen in a very long time.
He has made this a labor of love, if you will, to uncover those. And he and his students have spent years, he's been working on it for almost 20 years, have spent years and years trying to find historical records.
And Dr. Walsh's research has been able to literally and figuratively bring those names up again for their family and loved ones to find. And to me, that's what's so compelling and exciting about this work, is how we can bring them back to life and honor them and connect them with their families who maybe never knew what happened to them after they went west of the Mississippi.
When I was earning my doctorate, I was learning my own genealogy. And I was learning that almost every branch in my family were famine refugees from Ireland. I would come up here for a week at a time, and Annunciation Catholic Church gave me a key to the rectory so I could sleep on the couch. I would pour through their records, and I met Kathleen Fitzsimmons as part of that process, and she said one day, "I have to show you something." Well, Kathleen brought me to the pauper section. And she somehow knew that that was where I needed to be. And she brought me back there, and I stood there, and I just remember standing in the midst of all of those sunken graves. And because I was in the process of learning about my own roots and who I am, I think it was the perfect time in my life to be in that space. This is what historians, the work we come to do, we have to love it. And to love it, we have to feel connected to it. And I knew that this was the work I wanted to do. I started telling people about it. I started writing about it.
So the research has surfaced ages and names and surnames and where they came from. And it is such a wealth of information.
A good friend, he called me one day and he said, "That cemetery in Leadville, Jim, the Irish government needs to know about this cemetery. They need to know." And I said, "Why would the Irish government care about some small town cemetery?" And the next thing I know, he fired off an email to the consulate's office demanding that they come to Leadville and see this cemetery. It worked. The consul general visited maybe just a month or two later, and we made a commitment that we were going to memorialize not just the Irish, but all the people buried there in those sunken holes.
So part of the work that has come out of Jim's research is realizing that of these 1,400 graves, 75% have Irish surnames or came from Ireland. And it shows how significant Leadville was as an Irish destination. The Irish government has an entire section of funding and historical focus on the Irish diaspora, the spread of Irish all across the world, and to be able to find something like Evergreen Cemetery, where you can actually see the names of these people, that was something very significant for the Irish government. And so they have written several grants which have provided a lot of the funding to create the Irish Miners Memorial. So the Irish Miners Memorial is a gathering place in which folks can visit Evergreen Cemetery and get a sense of the sacred space that is the paupers' graves. The focal point statue is looking just over the rock facing Ireland, and then surrounding him are panels with the names of everybody who's buried there. And for some of these, this may be the first time their name has seen the light of day since they were buried. And so the Irish Miners Memorial, it isn't just about the Irish. It isn't just about miners. It's about the struggle of immigration and really that human experience connecting the hope for something better and the risk of leaving something behind. And that transcends race and time.
The majority of the immigrant community today are from Chihuahua, but I see that community as representing exactly what the 19th century Irish community represented, which was finding some strength in numbers and some stability in numbers and scratching and clawing for a dignified existence. And so this is a continuation of the same cycle.
I would hope that by connectedness to our ancestors, we would wake up to the fact that many still are living precarious lives, and we don't forget that. That's what I would hope.
So the Leadville story and the memorial that's being built in the cemetery speak to the traumatic history that's been forgotten or ignored or pushed way deep down inside, not passed down. This pauper cemetery symbolizes not just those buried there, but other working class communities. It's a little memorial, but its symbolism has a radius that continues to grow. And that's exciting because we're moving the lens of history from the movers and shakers to the people who had to practice different forms of resistance because they didn't enjoy any political or social or economic capital.